The Montana sky stretched endlessly above the Broken Creek Ranch, painted in shades of amber and rust as autumn claimed the land. Samuel Hartwell stood on his porch, weathered hands gripping the wooden railing that had supported 3 generations of his family. At 70 years old, his body carried the weight of decades spent working this unforgiving soil, but his mind remained sharp as the winter wind that would soon sweep across these fields. The ranch sprawled across 2,000 acres, a patchwork of pastures and cropland that had once thrived under his father's careful stewardship. Now, much of it lay fallow, overgrown with wild grasses that swayed like ghosts of harvests past. Samuel's wife, Margaret, had passed 5 years ago, leaving him alone in the sprawling farmhouse that echoed with memories. Their only son, David, had moved to Seattle 20 years back, chasing dreams of technology and city life that Samuel could never understand. The visits had become annual obligations, brief and uncomfortable, filled with David's thinly veiled suggestions about retirement communities and selling the land to developers who circled like vultures, sensing weakness. The ranch was dying, and Samuel knew it. His knees ached with every step, his back protested each morning when he rose before dawn, and his hands trembled slightly when he tried to mend fences or repair equipment. He'd let go of the hired hands one by one over the years, unable to afford their wages as crop yields diminished and cattle prices fluctuated. Now it was just him, an old man fighting against time and nature itself. But Samuel harbored a plan, one born from desperation and an iron will that refused to let his family's legacy crumble into dust. He'd spent months researching, reading everything he could find about sustainable farming, regenerative agriculture, and new techniques that could breathe life back into depleted soil. He'd contacted the Agricultural Extension Office, spoken with younger farmers who'd successfully transformed failing operations, and slowly assembled a vision of what Broken Creek could become. The problem was execution. Every plan required money he didn't have, energy his aging body couldn't sustain, and time that was running out faster than he cared to admit. The bank had already sent polite but firm letters about the mortgage, and his savings had dwindled to almost nothing. David called every Sunday, each conversation circling back to the same conclusion: sell the ranch, move into town, accept that this chapter had ended. Samuel refused to accept that ending. This land held his father's sweat, his grandfather's dreams, and Margaret's laughter on summer evenings when they'd sit on this very porch, watching the sun paint the sky. He remembered teaching David to ride horses in the south pasture, remembered Margaret's garden that once buzzed with vegetables and flowers, remembered feeling like a steward of something greater than himself. One evening in late September, as Samuel sat reviewing papers that outlined his desperate plan, a truck pulled into the long driveway, its headlights cutting through the gathering darkness. He didn't recognize the vehicle, a newer model pickup that looked out of place against the ranch's rustic backdrop. A young woman emerged, maybe 30 years old, with sun-streaked brown hair pulled into a practical ponytail. She carried herself with confidence as she approached the porch, her boots suggesting she was no stranger to ranch work. "Mr. Hartwell," she called out, her voice clear and strong. "My name is Elena Martinez. I heard you might need help saving this place." Samuel studied her carefully, suspicion and hope warring in his chest. He'd learned long ago that nothing came without a price, but something in her direct gaze made him curious. "What makes you think this place needs saving?" he asked, his voice gruff. Elena smiled, a knowing expression that suggested she understood more than he'd expected. "Because I grew up on a ranch like this one, and I watched my family lose it because they waited too long to ask for help." Elena climbed the porch steps without waiting for an invitation, and Samuel found himself appreciating her boldness. She carried a worn leather folder under one arm, and when she spread its contents across his weathered porch table, he saw detailed plans, soil analyses, and financial projections that looked far more professional than anything he'd managed to compile. She'd done her homework, and that impressed him despite his natural wariness toward strangers bearing solutions to impossible problems. "I've been studying your property for the past 3 months, Elena explained, pointing to aerial photographs she'd somehow acquired. "Your land has incredible potential, Mr. Hartwell. The soil composition is actually better than most ranches in this county. You've got natural water sources, good drainage, and elevation that protects against late frosts. The problem isn't the land itself, it's how it's been managed in recent years." Samuel bristled at the implied criticism, but he bit back his defensive response. She wasn't wrong, and pride had no place in survival. He'd stretched himself too thin trying to maintain traditional farming methods without the manpower or capital to do them justice. Elena continued, her enthusiasm evident as she outlined a comprehensive transformation plan that involved rotational grazing, cover crops, and partnerships with local restaurants and farmers markets hungry for organic, locally sourced products. I know what you're thinking, Elena said, meeting his skeptical gaze directly. You're wondering what I want out of this, why some stranger would show up offering to help rescue a failing ranch. The truth is, I need this as much as you do. I spent 10 years working on corporate farms, implementing these exact techniques for companies that cared more about quarterly profits than the land itself. I'm tired of making other people rich while watching family farms disappear. I want to prove these methods work on a real ranch, with real stakes. They talked until past midnight that first night, Elena answering every question Samuel threw at her with patience and expertise that gradually wore down his resistance. She proposed a partnership. She'd invest her savings and sweat equity in exchange for a percentage of future profits and a place to live on the property. She'd handle the physical labor and modern marketing strategies while he provided the land, equipment, and decades of traditional farming knowledge. Together, they might accomplish what neither could alone. Samuel wanted to believe her, but trust didn't come easily to a man who'd been disappointed so many times. He insisted on a trial period, 3 months to see if her grand plans could translate into actual results. Elena agreed immediately, shaking his hand with a grip that reminded him of Margaret's fierce determination. That handshake sealed a partnership that would test both of them in ways neither anticipated. The work began at dawn the next morning. Elena moved into the old foreman's cottage, a small structure that hadn't housed anyone in 15 years. While Samuel watched with a mixture of admiration and concern, she attacked the ranch's problems with relentless energy. She started by dividing the pastures into smaller paddocks for rotational grazing, explaining how this would allow grass to recover and soil to regenerate. She brought in a soil scientist friend who took samples and recommended specific cover crop mixtures to rebuild depleted nutrients. Within the first week, Elena had contacted every restaurant within 50 miles, pitching them on farm-to-table partnerships. She created social media accounts for the ranch, posting stunning photographs of the Montana landscape and explaining their regenerative practices. Orders began trickling in, small at first but growing as word spread about their commitment to sustainable agriculture. Samuel found himself learning from someone young enough to be his granddaughter, and the reversal of roles both humbled and energized him. The physical work was brutal. Even with Elena shouldering most of the heavy labor, Samuel pushed himself harder than he had in years. They repaired fences, cleared irrigation ditches, and planted winter cover crops that would lie dormant until spring. His body protested every evening, but the pain felt different now, purposeful rather than futile. Elena proved herself tougher than she looked, working 16-hour days without complaint, her optimism never wavering even when equipment broke down or unexpected expenses arose. By the end of October, the ranch looked different. Not transformed, not yet, but definitely awakened from its long decline. Green shoots of cover crops emerged in fields that had lain barren, and the cattle they'd kept seemed healthier, more vigorous in their smaller, frequently rotated paddocks. Samuel caught himself smiling more often, feeling a spark of hope he'd thought long extinguished. November brought the first serious test of their partnership. Samuel's son David arrived for Thanksgiving, his expensive sedan looking absurdly out of place parked next to work trucks and tractors. He'd brought his wife Jennifer and their 2 teenage children, a family Samuel barely knew despite sharing blood. The visit started cordially enough, but tension built as David walked the property, his expression growing increasingly concerned as he took in the scope of changes Elena had initiated. "Dad, we need to talk," David said after dinner, his tone carrying the patronizing patience of someone addressing a confused elderly relative. "This woman has you spending money you don't have on some experimental farming scheme. Do you realize how this looks? You're 70 years old, you should be relaxing, not killing yourself trying to reinvent a failing business." Samuel felt his temper rising, but he forced himself to remain calm. "Elena knows what she's doing. We're already seeing results. The soil tests show improvement, we've got contracts with 3 restaurants, and the cattle are healthier than they've been in years." David shook his head, pulling out his phone to show spreadsheets and projections his wife had prepared. "In 10 years, this land will be worth triple what it is now if the development plan for the valley goes through. We could sell now, pay off all your debts, and you'd have enough money to live comfortably for the rest of your life. Instead, you're gambling everything on some young woman's promises. What do you really know about her?" The question struck deeper than David intended. Samuel realized he'd invested enormous trust in Elena based primarily on intuition and desperate hope. He'd verified her agricultural credentials but hadn't conducted the kind of background check David would consider due diligence. Still, he'd seen her work ethic, witnessed her knowledge, and felt in his bones that she genuinely cared about the land's future. "I know she's trying to save something worth saving," Samuel replied, his voice hardening. "Unlike you, who seems determined to turn your inheritance into a suburban subdivision. The argument escalated, words exchanged that both men would later regret. Jennifer intervened, suggesting they table the discussion until everyone had cooled down. But the damage was done, and the remainder of the visit passed under a cloud of mutual disappointment and unresolved conflict. When David's family departed the next morning, the goodbye felt more like an ending than a temporary separation. Elena had made herself scarce during the family drama, but she found Samuel on the porch that evening, staring at the land he'd fought so hard to protect. She sat beside him in silence for a while before speaking. "I heard some of what your son said. He's not entirely wrong, you know. This is a gamble, and I've asked you to risk everything you have left. Do you believe in what we're doing?" Samuel asked directly. "Yes," Elena answered without hesitation. "But belief doesn't guarantee success. Farming never does. Weather, markets, equipment failures, there are 1,000 things that could still go wrong. Your son loves you, he's just showing it by trying to protect you from risk." Samuel nodded, appreciating her honesty. "My whole life has been a risk. Every seed planted is a gamble against drought, frost, pests, and markets. David grew up seeing the failures, the years we barely scraped by, and he swore he'd never put himself through that uncertainty. I can't fault him for choosing a different path, but I can't follow him down it either. This ranch is who I am." December tested them further. An early blizzard hit hard, dumping 3 feet of snow and bringing temperatures that plunged below zero. Pipes froze, equipment failed, and several cattle developed respiratory infections despite their best efforts at prevention. Samuel and Elena worked around the clock, breaking ice in water troughs, delivering hay, and treating sick animals. The physical strain pushed Samuel to his limits, and one morning Elena found him collapsed in the barn, too exhausted to stand. She half carried him back to the house, her face tight with worry that she tried to hide. For 3 days, Samuel was confined to bed, his body finally demanding the rest he'd refused to give it. Elena ran the ranch alone during that time, and Samuel lay awake at night listening to her footsteps on the porch, knowing she was checking on things every few hours despite her own exhaustion. When he recovered enough to move around, Samuel found Elena asleep at the kitchen table, her head resting on financial statements that showed they'd burned through most of their emergency reserves dealing with the storm damage. The situation looked bleak, but instead of despair, Samuel felt determination crystallizing into something harder and more resilient than hope. January arrived with brutal clarity. The bank scheduled a meeting that Samuel could no longer postpone, and the numbers told an unforgiving story. Despite Elena's best efforts and the promising start they'd made, winter expenses had depleted their resources faster than new revenue could replace them. The loan officer, a young man named Patterson who'd gone to school with David, laid out the options with practiced sympathy that felt like salt in an open wound. "Mr. Hartwell, I've known you my whole life, and nobody wants to see you lose this place," Patterson said, his fingers drumming nervously on the folder containing Samuel's financial fate. "But the bank needs to see a viable path forward. Right now, you're 3 months behind on mortgage payments, you've maxed out your operating line of credit, and your projected income doesn't cover basic expenses, let alone debt service." Elena sat beside Samuel, her jaw set with determination that couldn't quite hide the defeat in her eyes. She'd prepared detailed projections showing how spring planting and increased restaurant contracts would generate revenue, but Patterson had seen too many optimistic forecasts from desperate farmers to be swayed by hope alone. The bank wanted collateral, guarantees, something concrete beyond faith in regenerative agriculture and hard work. "Give us until spring," Samuel heard himself saying, his voice steadier than he felt. "Let us plant the crops Elena's planned, let the rotational grazing show results, and if we can't make the payments by June, I'll sign whatever papers you need." Patterson looked uncomfortable, caught between institutional policy and personal sympathy. He promised to present Samuel's request to the board, but his expression suggested the outcome was already decided. Walking out of the bank into the bitter January wind, Samuel felt every one of his 70 years pressing down on him. Elena drove them home in silence, her knuckles white on the steering wheel. That night, Samuel did something he hadn't done since Margaret's death, he cried. Not from self-pity, but from the overwhelming weight of impending failure. Elena found him in the barn, tears freezing on his weathered cheeks, and she sat beside him in the straw without saying a word. Sometimes comfort came not from solutions but from shared silence, and they sat there together until the cold drove them inside. The following week brought an unexpected visitor. A man named Thomas Chen pulled up in a Tesla that looked absurdly futuristic against the ranch's rustic backdrop. He introduced himself as a venture capitalist from San Francisco who specialized in sustainable agriculture investments. He'd seen Elena's social media posts about their regenerative farming techniques and wanted to learn more about their operation. Samuel's initial reaction was deep suspicion. He'd dealt with enough smooth-talking salesmen and consultants over the years to recognize when someone wanted something. But Thomas surprised him by asking intelligent questions, getting his expensive shoes dirty walking the fields, and demonstrating genuine knowledge about soil health and sustainable practices. He spent an entire day examining their operation, reviewing Elena's plans, and analyzing the property's potential. "I'll be direct with you," Thomas said as the sun set on his visit. "You're sitting on a gold mine, but you're starving because you can't wait for the harvest. Traditional banks don't understand regenerative agriculture's timeline. They want quarterly returns on investments that take years to mature. I represent investors who think differently, who understand that healing land and building sustainable food systems requires patient capital." The offer he presented was simultaneously generous and alarming. His firm would invest enough capital to pay off the bank, upgrade equipment, and cover operating expenses for 2 years. In exchange, they'd own 40% of the ranch's equity and have significant input on operational decisions. Samuel would retain majority ownership and control, but he'd be accountable to investors who'd expect detailed reports and measurable progress. Elena studied the proposal with intensity, her business background helping her parse the complex legal language. "It's actually a fair deal," she admitted, surprise evident in her voice. "Most venture agreements would demand controlling interest. This lets you keep the ranch while giving us the resources we need to make it work." Samuel spent a sleepless night wrestling with the decision. He'd always been fiercely independent, resisting partnerships and outside investment as threats to his autonomy. But pride was a luxury he could no longer afford, and refusing help out of stubbornness would only guarantee the outcome he most feared. Margaret's voice seemed to whisper in his memory, reminding him that strength sometimes meant knowing when to accept assistance. The next morning, Samuel called Thomas and accepted the offer. The process moved quickly after that, lawyers drawing up agreements that transformed Broken Creek Ranch from a family operation into something new and untested. David called, furious when he learned about the deal, accusing Samuel of being manipulated by strangers while shutting out his own family. The conversation ended badly, with words spoken that deepened the rift between father and son. Spring arrived with a violence of color and life that seemed to mock the previous month's darkness. The cover crops Elena had planted in autumn exploded with growth, transforming fallow fields into seas of green that drew curious attention from neighboring ranches. Samuel found himself giving impromptu tours, explaining rotational grazing and soil regeneration to skeptical peers who'd written him off as a lost cause. Some dismissed his efforts as foolish experimentation, but others listened with the quiet desperation of people watching their own operations slowly fail. The investment money allowed them to hire help, young people drawn by Elena's social media presence and the opportunity to learn sustainable farming techniques. The ranch transformed into an unexpected teaching operation, hosting workshops and tours that generated additional revenue while spreading knowledge Elena considered more valuable than money. Samuel watched his property become a hub of activity, young voices and laughter filling spaces that had been silent for too long. Thomas's firm proved to be partners rather than overlords, providing expertise without micromanaging. They connected Broken Creek with high-end restaurants in distant cities willing to pay premium prices for organic, sustainably raised beef and vegetables. They brought in marketing specialists who refined Elena's social media approach, turning the ranch into something of a regional celebrity while maintaining its authentic character. The operation grew beyond what Samuel had imagined possible, yet it remained fundamentally true to the vision he and Elena had shared on that first night. By midsummer, they were profitable. Not wildly so, but sustainably, with clear trajectories pointing toward long-term success. The soil tests showed dramatic improvement, with organic matter increasing and beneficial micro-populations exploding. The cattle thrived, gaining weight faster on rotated pastures than they ever had on traditional grazing. Restaurant partners praised the quality of their products, and waiting lists developed for their premium cuts and vegetables. David returned in July, ostensibly to check on his father but really to see if the rumors about the ranch's resurrection were true. He walked the property in silence, taking in the bustling activity, the healthy fields, and the infrastructure improvements that money and hard work had accomplished. Samuel watched his son wrestle with emotions he couldn't quite name, seeing perhaps a reflection of opportunities missed and paths not taken. They talked that evening, really talked for the first time in years. David admitted his fear that Samuel would die trying to save an impossible dream, his anger rooted in love rather than judgment. Samuel acknowledged that he'd been so focused on preserving the past that he'd failed to appreciate David's different dreams and accomplishments. The conversation didn't erase years of growing distance, but it opened a door that both men had assumed was permanently closed. "I was wrong," David said finally, the admission costing him visible effort. "About Elena, about the investment, about your ability to make this work. I'm sorry I didn't support you." Samuel gripped his son's shoulder, feeling the decades of unspoken words weighing between them. "You wanted to protect me. That's what sons do. But sometimes fathers need to take risks, even stupid ones, because the alternative is giving up on who we are." In August, Samuel turned 71, surrounded by more people than he'd seen on the property in 20 years. Elena had organized a celebration that doubled as a fundraiser for beginning farmers, turning his birthday into something larger than personal milestone. David attended with his family, his children actually engaging with the ranch rather than treating it as tedious obligation. Samuel watched his teenage grandson help with evening chores, showing unexpected aptitude and interest that suggested maybe the family connection to this land might survive another generation after all. As the sun set on that birthday evening, Samuel stood in the same spot where he'd stood a year ago, contemplating defeat and ending. The view looked the same in some ways, the Montana sky still stretched endlessly above the same mountains and valleys. But everything had changed. The fields thrived with careful cultivation, cattle moved through healthy pastures, and the ranch hummed with purposeful activity. Elena joined him, her presence having become as familiar and essential as the land itself. "Thank you," Samuel said simply. "For what?" she asked, though her smile suggested she knew. "For seeing what this place could be when I'd lost the vision. For having the courage to knock on a stranger's door with a crazy plan. For not giving up when things got hard." Elena shook her head. "You gave me something too. A chance to prove that doing things right matters more than doing them fast. A place where I could plant seeds and actually see them grow into something meaningful." They stood in comfortable silence, watching the sun paint the sky in colors that would fade and return tomorrow, next week, next season, in the eternal cycle of growth and harvest that connected them to something larger than individual lives. The ranch would face new challenges, agriculture always did, but Samuel no longer faced them alone. He'd learned that legacy wasn't about preserving the past unchanged, but about adapting it so future generations could build something worth inheriting. His seed had taken root, not in the way he'd originally imagined, but in a form more resilient and promising than his solitary struggle could ever have achieved. The work would continue long after he was gone, carried forward by Elena and perhaps by David's children, by the young farmers they trained and inspired, by anyone who believed that land deserved more than exploitation and abandonment. Samuel had spread his vision wider, partnering instead of isolating, adapting instead of rigidly maintaining, and he wouldn't stop until that vision took root in ways that outlasted any single person's lifetime. The lonely rancher wasn't lonely anymore, and the dying ranch had found new life. Sometimes the greatest legacy came not from doing everything yourself, but from accepting help to accomplish what needed doing.